It was one of those clear Tennessee mornings that seemed too ordinary to remember, until it became the kind everyone in town would never forget. Sunday, March 22nd, 2009. The congregation at St. Andrew's Chapel in Pine Hollow filled the small wooden pews like they did every week. Melissa Crane arrived just before the service began, driving her dusty blue Dodge Caravan, the one with the dented bumper and the faded Pine Hollow Elementary sticker on the back window. Her two sons, Eli and Jonah, were half awake in the back seat, dressed in their pressed church shirts and clip-on ties. She smiled as she helped them out, tucking Jonah's collar back into place. To anyone watching, it looked like a picture of small-town normalcy, a mom doing her best. Inside, she took her usual seat near the front left pew, halfway between the altar and the stained glass of the shepherd. Melissa had always been a quiet presence, a regular, someone who baked for bake sales, volunteered at the summer fair, and stayed late to help clean up after potlucks. People said she carried herself like someone trying to hold it all together, polite, kind, but always a little distant. Her divorce the year before had been rough, but she'd managed to keep her head down. Everyone said she loved those boys more than anything. After the final hymn, she lingered outside the chapel steps, chatting with a few neighbors. She laughed at a joke from Mrs. Dalton, promised to bring cookies for next week's fundraiser, and then almost imperceptibly something changed. Her phone buzzed. She stepped away from the crowd, walked toward the parking lot, and took the call. One witness, an older man who tended the church garden, remembered the way her face dropped mid-sentence. He said she looked like she'd just seen something she couldn't unsee. She turned her back to the lot, pacing, one hand over her forehead. Then, as quickly as she'd gone pale, she ended the call, scooped up her sons, and said goodbye. Her voice, according to another parishioner, was shaky, almost apologetic. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. By 4 p.m., Melissa's parents grew concerned. She was supposed to stop by for Sunday dinner like she did every week, bringing Eli's favorite peach cobbler. They called her cell. No answer. They tried again an hour later. Still nothing. By 8 p.m., her father drove out toward her rental house at the edge of town. The lights were off, the minivan gone. Her purse wasn't inside, but both boys' school backpacks were still by the kitchen table. It was as if they'd planned to come right back. At 9:32 p.m., the Cranes called Pine Hollow police to file a missing persons report. In a town that small, word spread faster than official alerts ever could. By morning, the parking lot outside St. Andrews was lined with reporters' vans and churchgoers whispering theories. Officers canvassed the area between the chapel and Route 6. They found nothing, no tire marks, no debris, no sign of distress. But on Tuesday, a patrol deputy spotted something odd about 2 miles from the church. Melissa's van, parked near a fishing access turnout, hidden by early spring brush. The driver's side door was unlocked. The Bible she always kept on the seat was still there, open to Psalms. The keys were missing. Her phone wasn't inside. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like she'd simply walked away, but her parents insisted she'd never leave her boys unattended, not even for a minute. Investigators checked the nearby creek for footprints. Nothing. The ground was firm. Even the dogs couldn't pick up a solid scent trail. It was as if the three of them had just vanished into thin air. Detectives questioned the obvious people first. Melissa's ex-husband, Aaron Crane, a construction worker who lived 40 miles north in Knoxville. He was cooperative, emotional even. His alibi held up. He'd been working a pier, weekend renovation job with 2 co-workers. He showed up in person to plead with police to find his kids. For a moment, suspicion turned toward him, but it dissolved just as quickly when the timeline didn't fit. Phone records proved he hadn't spoken to Melissa since the week before. As the hours passed, the tone around town shifted from worry to quiet dread. Melissa's friends gathered at her parents' home, rehashing every conversation they'd ever had with her. One mentioned that Melissa had seemed uneasy that last week, distracted during Bible study, mentioning trouble she needed to get away from. But she didn't elaborate, and nobody pressed her. That small detail, so ordinary at the time, suddenly took on a chilling weight. The first press conference brought no new leads. The sheriff described it as a disappearance without a trace. The last confirmed sighting was 11:38 a.m., leaving the church parking lot. After that, no credit card activity, no cell pings, no confirmed witness sightings. Her van had less than a quarter tank of gas, which made no sense. She couldn't have gone far. Yet every surrounding road came up empty. Within a week, flyers were posted on gas pumps, post office boards, and telephone poles across 3 counties. The photo showed Melissa smiling beside her boys at a county fair, all sunburnt cheeks and bright eyes, a picture that didn't fit the horror that followed. A $10,000 reward was offered. Locals volunteered to search the back roads and hiking trails. Search teams dragged ponds, combed ravines, and even checked abandoned barns. Nothing turned up. Not a shoe. Not a single clue. Behind closed doors, investigators began to whisper about darker possibilities. A staged disappearance, a hidden relationship, a family abduction. But each theory fell apart the moment it was tested. Melissa's financials were clean. Her passport was expired. There were no unexplained withdrawals, no secret storage units, no signs of planning. Her last Google search was Sunday school craft ideas. Nothing about it made sense. Meanwhile, the gossip around Pine Hollow grew crueler. Some whispered that Melissa had snapped under pressure and done something unthinkable. Others believed she'd been taken, maybe by someone from church, maybe by a stranger passing through. But the call outside Street Andrews lingered in everyone's minds. Detectives pulled phone logs and discovered the number that had reached her came from a prepaid cell phone registered under a fake name. The phone had been activated just 2 days earlier, and deactivated hours after the call. There were no other outgoing messages. It was a dead end. Melissa's parents clung to the idea she'd been forced to leave, that she was still alive somewhere trying to protect her boys. Her mother told reporters she had a feeling that Melissa was scared, not gone. The town, though, began to move on. Another missing poster, torn down. Another church pew left empty. The case stalled, and for now, the official word was active but unsolved. The unofficial truth was that Pine Hollow had buried its hope. Yet something about that unlocked van, that open Bible, and that one untraceable phone call refused to fade. Even years later, detectives would admit something about that Sunday morning didn't sit right. And deep down, everyone knew the real story of what happened to Melissa and her boys hadn't been buried. It had just been waiting to be found. The search for Melissa Crane and her 2 boys began the same way most searches do, with urgency, with hope, with people believing they'd be found within hours. On that first Monday morning, cars lined both sides of Route 6, and hundreds of volunteers from Pine Hollow and nearby towns showed up to help. They carried flashlights, bottled water, printed maps, and a quiet determination that only small towns seem to have. Everyone knew someone who knew Melissa. Teachers remembered her bringing cupcakes to class. A cashier at the grocery store said she'd seen her just a day before. But as the hours turned into days, and days into weeks, the search for a living mother and 2 children began to feel more like a search for ghosts. Sheriff's deputies divided the area into grids: farmland to the north, forest to the south, and the maze of old mining roads that wound through the hills in every direction. By day 3, search dogs were deployed, circling the brush and creek beds near where her van had been found. Drones flew overhead, scanning for heat signatures or signs of disturbed earth. They found nothing. The terrain was rugged and full of old sinkholes from abandoned mines, some over 100 feet deep. There was talk that she might have driven off a washed-out service road and gotten trapped. But when rescue teams lowered cameras into the nearest shafts, there was no sign of a vehicle. Just silence, dripping water, and the stale air of a place long forgotten. By the end of the first week, the case had already started pulling at the seams of Pine Hollow's trust. Reporters camped outside Street Andrews Chapel, asking if the pastor had noticed anything strange that day. Church members spoke in cautious tones. One woman said Melissa had been acting off for months, talking about protecting her boys from something evil. Others dismissed it as gossip, the kind of story people tell when they can't stand the uncertainty. Investigators interviewed dozens of parishioners, teachers, friends, and her ex-husband again. Everyone had a theory, but no one had evidence. One detective described it later as trying to solve a puzzle where all the pieces are sky. Then, on the 8th day, a small breakthrough, if it could be called that. A volunteer found a scrap of blue fabric caught on barbed wire along an old cattle fence about 2 miles from where the van was found. It looked like part of a child's jacket. The fabric was worn, the edges frayed by weather. When Melissa's parents saw it, they broke down. It matched the color of Jonah's favorite jacket, the one he wore to Sunday school. But forensic testing came back inconclusive. No blood, no DNA. It was something, but it wasn't enough. After 2 weeks, national outlets picked up the story. A mother and 2 sons disappearing after church. It was the kind of mystery that gripped audiences, the kind that made people imagine their own families in that van. The sheriff's department fielded hundreds of tips, most of them dead ends. One caller swore they saw a woman resembling Melissa at a gas station in Kentucky, traveling with 2 kids. Another claimed she'd joined a religious commune near Nashville. Each lead was followed, each one evaporated. Behind the scenes, investigators debated 3 working theories. The first, abduction. The problem was there were no signs of a struggle, no ransom demands, no witnesses. The second, voluntary disappearance. But Melissa's finances didn't support it. Her bank account had less than $300. She'd never withdrawn cash, never searched for new housing, and left behind her son's medical records, birth certificates, even their toys. The third theory was the one detectives didn't like saying out loud: a family annihilation or religious delusion. Some church members insisted Melissa had grown paranoid in the months before, talking about signs and evil in the world. But those close to her said she'd been under stress, not delusional. Phone records deepened the mystery. The last incoming call to her phone, the one she took outside church, came from a prepaid cell registered under the name Daniel Kerr. The address tied to it was fake. The number had been activated 2 days before the disappearance and shut off hours after. Investigators traced its purchase to a convenience store in Johnson City. But surveillance footage was overwritten by the time they checked. Whoever made that call had known what they were doing. As the weeks dragged on, hope bled away. The search radius expanded to 30 miles. Helicopters swept over remote hollows and floodplains. Dive teams scoured local ponds. They brought in cadaver dogs again, this time focusing on the logging roads beyond Old Cedar Pass. But the dogs came up empty. The case files filled with maps, photos, and interviews, but not answers. By early summer, the community that had once stood shoulder to shoulder began to fracture. Whispers grew louder, some accusing the ex-husband, others suggesting Melissa's parents knew more than they let on. The Cranes endured cruel messages online. Anonymous commenters accused them of covering something up. Even their mailbox became a target for hate notes and Bible verses scribbled in red ink. Detectives rotated through the case. Each one inherited the same dead-end evidence, the same unanswered question. What happened after that phone call? In August, the sheriff's department held one last official search before scaling back. They gathered more than 50 volunteers at dawn and swept a 10-mile radius along the riverbed south of Pine Hollow. The day was brutally hot, and by noon, half the team had turned back. Late that afternoon, a storm rolled in, washing out sections of the trail. The search was suspended indefinitely. The case file was labeled inactive. By fall, the news crews were gone. The missing posters faded on poles, rain-streaked and sun-bleached, their corners curling. Melissa's parents continued to call the sheriff's office weekly, their voices quieter each time. Her mother told a local paper, "It's like the world just stopped looking." Even the church grew quieter about it. Street Andrews held a candlelight vigil that winter, reading her name aloud, along with Eli's and Jonah's. Fewer than 30 people came. Most stayed home, uneasy about what the story had done to their small town. The years began to pass, and Melissa's disappearance turned into something people referenced in whispers, a cautionary tale, a dark piece of local history. Kids who were in Sunday school that morning grew up hearing their parents say, "Don't ever stop for strangers on the road." Old friends stopped mentioning her altogether, like her name carried bad luck. The sheriff retired in 2016, leaving the case boxes stacked in evidence storage, covered in dust. He called it his biggest regret. There were no more press briefings, no more searches, just silence. Pine Hollow became another mark on the map of America's unsolved grief, the kind of story that fades from headlines but never really ends for the people left behind. Still, that one question never went away. Who called her that morning? And why did that single phone call lead to 3 lives disappearing in less than an hour? Years later, when a retired trooper pulled that file again, he'd find something small, something everyone else had missed, and it would change everything. For 15 years, the Crane house on the edge of Pine Hollow stood frozen in time. Melissa's parents never moved her things. The boys' drawings still covered the refrigerator, her calendar still marked with church events that would never come. They kept the front porch light on every night, a silent promise to 3 faces that never came home. The rest of the town moved on. Kids who'd been classmates to Eli and Jonah graduated, left, started families of their own. The case file, once thick with reports and search maps, was boxed, labeled, and pushed into the back of a county storage room. By 2010, the Crane disappearance had already joined the long list of unsolved cases people mention in lowered voices. Detectives rotated in and out, each one taking a look, finding nothing new, and passing it along. The original sheriff retired. The younger deputies who took over had only ever known the story as something that happened back then. But for Melissa's parents, it never stopped being now. Every birthday, every Christmas, they set the table for 3 more chairs. Her mother couldn't bring herself to throw away the half-used bottle of her daughter's shampoo, the one that still sat in the bathroom cabinet. Her father stopped attending church altogether. Time dulled public interest, but it didn't kill it completely. Around 2015, the case found a second life online. A thread on a missing persons forum sparked hundreds of theories, some plausible, most not. Posters dissected every known fact: the phone call, the unlocked van, the Bible left open. Some said Melissa had joined a cult that promised protection from the coming judgment. Others insisted she'd been taken by human traffickers. One thread accused the church itself of covering up the truth. It turned the Crane disappearance into a digital ghost story, part fact, part rumor, all speculation. Detectives tried to ignore the online noise, but one retired officer, Henry Dobbins, couldn't. He'd been a young trooper during the original search, barely in his 30s then, and he'd never quite let the case go. He remembered how the early days of the investigation felt frantic but unfinished, how leads had been dropped once the media faded. In 2023, long after leaving the force, he decided to request access to the archived evidence. He said it wasn't about reopening the case, at least, not officially. He just couldn't stand the feeling that something had been missed. Inside the archives, the boxes looked ordinary: brown cardboard, faded labels, the smell of old paper. He went through witness statements, search maps, property logs, even the forensic reports from the van. None of it surprised him. But when he reached the section marked Surveillance Local Businesses, something caught his attention. The timestamp on a printed still image from a gas station camera supposedly showing Melissa's van leaving Pine Hollow that Sunday didn't match the lighting in the photo. The timestamp said 11:52 a.m., but the shadows in the frame stretched long and flat, like late afternoon. At first, he thought it was a copying error. But when he checked other evidence, something else stood out. No one had ever verified the original footage. The more Dobbins looked, the stranger it became. The original detective's notes referenced the footage as supporting the last known direction of travel, but there was no record of who collected it, when it was logged, or where it was stored now. The digital copy in the file was compressed and incomplete, missing several seconds of footage before and after the van appeared. Dobbins filed a formal request to access the physical evidence at the county property room. It took weeks, and more than one phone call reminding the clerk that he was once on the force himself. But eventually, he got it. The box was unsealed for the first time in nearly a decade. Inside was a DVD marked Gas Mart, the 22nd of March, 2009. He took it home, loaded it on his old desktop, and watched. The footage was grainy, timestamp flickering in the corner. Cars came and went, sunlight shifting across the concrete. Then, at 11:52, the familiar blue Dodge Caravan rolled through the frame, heading west. But Dobbins paused, zoomed in, and stared. The trees behind the lot weren't lit like midday. They glowed orange. The sun was low. He rewound and played it again, slower this time. The license plate matched Melissa's van, but the lighting didn't. That night, he couldn't sleep. He checked the weather logs for Pine Hollow on March 22nd. Sunset that day was 7:17 p.m. The timestamp didn't just seem off, it was off by nearly 6 hours. That meant the footage might not show the moment she left the church at all. It might have been later, much later. He started calling in old favors. A friend from the state crime lab helped him run a frame analysis on the video. The metadata confirmed it, the timestamp had been manually set. Someone had changed it. The discovery hit him like a gut punch. For 15 years, everyone had believed Melissa's van was last seen heading west before noon. Search teams had focused their efforts along that route, but what if she'd gone the other direction? What if the van had passed that gas station hours after the church service ended? If that was true, every search, every map, every theory had been built on the wrong timeline. He brought the findings to the new sheriff, who initially dismissed it as an old case with old errors. But when Dobbins showed him the frame data and the metadata logs, the sheriff agreed to recheck the footage with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Within a month, the TBI confirmed the manipulation. The file had been altered between its retrieval and submission in 2009. There was no chain of custody signature from the church's pastor, who had personally delivered the DVD to investigators back then. It wasn't proof of guilt, but it was enough to reopen the case. For the first time in 15 years, Pine Hollow found itself back in the news. Reporters returned. Locals who'd tried to forget were suddenly forced to remember. Melissa's parents, now in their 70s, sat in front of cameras again, their voices trembling as they begged for answers one last time. Dobbins watched all of it quietly. He wasn't interested in headlines. What haunted him were the missing 6 hours of blank space between the church service and the altered footage. If the van had truly gone west later that evening, it meant Melissa was still alive for hours after she was supposed to have vanished. That detail changed everything. And as he combed through the old maps and topography of that western route, one place caught his attention, a washed-out stretch of asphalt just past the county line. Locals called it Old Cedar Pass, a back road that had been partially destroyed by flooding years earlier and never reopened. It had been ruled out early on because the original timeline suggested she never went that way. But now, it was back on the map. The sheriff's department approved a new search order. Ground-penetrating radar, drones, cadaver dogs, the full scope. Dobbins went along, even though he didn't have to. He said he owed it to the family. No one knew what they'd find on that mountain road. But as the search crews began marking grids on the muddy hillside, Henry Dobbins had a sinking feeling that whatever was buried out there had been waiting a very long time to be found. When investigators enhanced the footage from the gas station, the picture that had sat dormant for 15 years suddenly changed. For more than a decade, everyone believed Melissa Crane's van had turned east that Sunday toward home. But when analysts digitally restored the frame and corrected the time code, the truth came into focus. The van was heading west, and for the first time, they could see a second figure. Just for a moment, a man's shadow leaning near the driver's side window before she pulled away. It was quick, almost invisible at normal speed, but it was there. Someone had been with her. The discovery blew a hole through everything the original investigation had assumed. If Melissa had driven west instead of east, she hadn't been going home. She was heading toward the back roads that wound through the hills, the same direction where the terrain dropped off into creeks and forgotten coal passes. Investigators began to remap her possible routes, overlaying the corrected timestamp with the geography. Only one road matched both the angle of the sun and the location captured on video, a stretch of crumbling asphalt known as Old Cedar Pass. Locals remembered the road well. Before the floods of 2011, it had been a shortcut between Pine Hollow and the neighboring county, but after years of landslides and erosion, it was closed off, impassable to most vehicles. Still, for someone desperate to avoid attention, it offered an isolated path through miles of forested ridges. When authorities announced they were reopening the case and focusing on the area west of town, Pine Hollow woke up all over again. The news brought back reporters, news vans, and the heavy silence that had once swallowed the place whole. The Cranes, now in their 70s, watched from their porch as satellite trucks parked along their street, lights flashing through their living room windows. They'd waited 15 years for answers, but now that the past was clawing its way back, they didn't know if they wanted to hear what it might say. Forensics teams arrived the following week. The sheriff's department partnered with state investigators and brought in ground-penetrating radar to sweep Old Cedar Pass. The first few days were slow. The road was overgrown, the soil unstable. They scanned every half-mile, mapping subsurface anomalies, metallic reflections, voids, anything that might hint at a buried vehicle. Most readings came back as rocks or compacted clay, but near mile marker 6, where the old road curved alongside a drop toward the riverbed, the sensors picked up something unusual. About 10 feet beneath the surface, a series of parallel impressions, narrow, rounded, and symmetrical, consistent with tire tracks, preserved in the hardened soil. A forensics tech marked the spot, called in the team, and began a limited excavation. Within hours, they uncovered a small fragment of rubber, torn, warped, but still bearing the faint imprint of a tread pattern. When cross-referenced against archived data, it matched the same tire model used on the 2003 Dodge Caravan Melissa had driven. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was close enough to change the tone of the entire search. The probability that her van had gone over that embankment, buried first by floodwater and later by a landslide, was suddenly very real. As the news broke, media outlets from across the country descended on the town. National morning shows ran headlines like 15-year mystery, vanished family's trail reopens, Pine Hollow's quiet streets filled with camera crews and strangers asking for interviews. Old neighbors who hadn't spoken in years gathered on front lawns to whisper about what might finally be unearthed. The Cranes didn't appear on camera. They stayed home, blinds drawn, waiting for a phone call that might finally end their nightmare. The excavation began on a cold March morning, nearly 16 years to the day since Melissa and her boys vanished. Crews used careful, controlled digging, removing layers of soil and stone inch by inch to avoid destabilizing the slope. As they worked deeper, they found evidence that the hillside had indeed collapsed sometime after the spring floods of 2011. The mud and sediment had created a natural seal. If a vehicle had been trapped beneath it, it could have been preserved almost perfectly. The process was methodical, painfully slow. Each new find, a shard of glass, a strip of metal, a fragment of plastic, was bagged, photographed, catalogued. Investigators refused to speculate publicly, but off record, one deputy admitted it felt like the kind of moment you only get once in a career. "You could feel it in your chest," he said later, "like the truth was right there under your feet." Meanwhile, forensic geologists analyzed the soil composition. The readings confirmed traces of hydraulic fluid and rust particulates in the surrounding clay materials, consistent with long-term vehicular decay in a waterlogged environment. Whatever was buried there had metal in it, and it had been there for a long time. Back in town, Henry Dobbins watched the coverage from his living room. He hadn't joined the field team. His role had been to find the clue that pointed them there, but every time the camera panned over that ridge, he felt a tightening in his chest. He knew that stretch of road. He'd driven it during the original search years ago, back when it was still open. He remembered standing on that curve, looking down into the valley, never realizing how close they'd been. The days stretched into weeks. Weather delays slowed the dig. Some townspeople began to murmur that maybe it was another false lead, another cruel twist in a story that refused to end. But then, late one afternoon, the excavation crew radioed up from the pit. They'd hit something solid, smooth, curved, and unmistakably metallic. Engineers stabilized the slope and brought in a small crane to continue. As the mud was peeled away, more of the structure appeared, not random debris, but a formed panel. The faint glint of faded blue paint still clinging beneath layers of earth. The team stopped. The sheriff confirmed it. They had found a vehicle. The announcement sent shockwaves through Pine Hollow. News crews reported live from the site. Residents gathered at the barricades, clutching umbrellas and cell phones, staring down the road that had haunted them for 15 years. Investigators refused to speculate publicly, but privately, everyone knew what it likely meant. Melissa's parents were notified that night. They didn't speak to reporters. Her mother's only words to the sheriff were quiet and final. Please don't let them hurt her again. The next morning, the excavation expanded to reveal the full outline of the van. The roof had caved slightly, sealed under layers of clay and stone. The front windshield was cracked inward, as if from impact. The license plate, though corroded, was legible enough for confirmation. It was Melissa Crane's Dodge Caravan. For the first time in 15 years, investigators had proof of where she went and how far. But the most important question remained, unanswered. What had sent her over that edge? As the forensic crews prepared to open the vehicle, tension spread through the town like static. Pine Hollow had lived with the mystery for so long that some didn't want it solved. Others needed it more than ever. And standing on that ridge, staring at the buried van, half exposed under the gray Tennessee sky, Henry Dobbins couldn't shake the feeling that what they were about to find inside wasn't just the answer to a disappearance, it was the truth everyone had tried to forget. When the van finally emerged from the earth, it was as if time itself exhaled. 16 years of silence gave way to the sound of steel groaning under the excavator's arm, mud sliding down in wet cascades, and the quiet disbelief of everyone standing there. Beneath 15 feet of packed clay and rock lay the blue Dodge Caravan, the same one that had left St. Andrew's Chapel all those years ago. The same one that had been searched for in every ravine, every river, every forgotten road. Now it sat entombed in Tennessee soil, its windows opaque, its shape warped by pressure and time, but still hauntingly familiar. Investigators stood shoulder to shoulder as the forensic team stabilized the site. Even after decades in law enforcement, some of them admitted later that nothing could have prepared them for the sight. The van was nearly intact, protected by the clay that had buried it. The earth had preserved it the way it might preserve a fossil. The faint blue paint was still visible beneath the muck, and when they cleared the last of the debris from the windshield, they saw the faint silhouette of what was inside. 3 figures, 1 adult, 2 small bodies. For days, crews worked under floodlights, careful not to disturb the contents until the structure could be safely extracted. Each movement was deliberate, slow, and silent. No one spoke more than necessary. Even the press, gathered beyond the barricades, kept their distance, their lenses aimed but unmoving. The story that had haunted Pine Hollow for years, the disappearance of Melissa Crane and her 2 sons, had finally reached its grim conclusion. Once the van was lifted and transported to the forensic bay, investigators began the painstaking process of opening it. The air that escaped when the door was pried open was heavy, metallic, and old. Inside, it was like stepping back into 2009. Melissa's purse sat on the passenger seat, its contents still neatly arranged. Lip balm, a half-used pack of tissues, a church bulletin folded in half. The Bible that had been missing from the van when it was first found all those years ago now lay waterlogged on the floorboard. Melissa was still in the driver's seat, seatbelt fastened, her hands twisted behind her as if she'd reached back in those final moments to shield her sons. The boys were found in the second row, both buckled in. Forensic anthropologists later noted that their positions suggested the impact had been instantaneous. There were no broken windows, no shattered glass, no signs of struggle. Whatever had happened, it happened fast within seconds. As the coroner's office began their analysis, the emotional weight of the discovery settled over everyone involved. Some officers quietly stepped outside. Others refused to leave the scene, saying they felt a responsibility to see it through. Melissa's parents were informed that same night. They didn't come in person. The sheriff personally drove to their home to deliver the news. Her father reportedly said nothing. Her mother just asked, "Were they together?" When he nodded, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Then that's enough." In the following days, investigators worked tirelessly to reconstruct what had happened. The physical evidence told a complicated story. The crash site was just beyond a sharp turn on Old Cedar Pass, a section that had collapsed during the floods 2 years after she vanished. Tire impressions in the preserved clay indicated that the van had been moving at a steady, controlled speed before the edge gave way. There were no skid marks, no signs of braking. That alone raised questions. Mechanical experts examined the engine and gear shift. The ignition was still turned on, and the van had been left in drive. The positioning of the pedals and steering column suggested no attempt had been made to swerve or stop. The theory that emerged was chilling. The vehicle had rolled forward intentionally. Whether by panic, accident, or choice, no one could say for sure. Toxicology reports showed no trace of drugs or alcohol in Melissa's system. There was no sign of carbon monoxide poisoning, no medical episode that could explain a sudden loss of control. The crash data recorder remarkably preserved indicated that the van's speed never exceeded 25 miles per hour. For a mother who had just left church with her children, the lack of braking didn't make sense, unless she wasn't alone. That possibility gained weight when forensic techs found a corroded cell phone lodged between the driver's seat and center console. It had been waterlogged, nearly destroyed, but its memory chip survived. When they extracted the data, they found only one saved file, a voicemail, time-stamped just hours before the disappearance. The audio was faint, warped, but clear enough to make out a man's voice. Just 4 words, "You can't hide them forever." The discovery turned everything on its head. Investigators traced the phone number back through old carrier data, but it was the same unregistered prepaid line that had called Melissa outside the church. The same phone no one had been able to trace 15 years ago. The case that had seemed finally closed was open again, not by mystery this time, but by evidence. The man's voice added a dimension no one had anticipated. It wasn't a random crash anymore. It wasn't just a tragedy buried in mud. Someone had been in contact with her that day. Someone who might have been there when she left. Forensics confirmed that the crash occurred within minutes of Melissa's last known call from the church parking lot. GPS data from the cell tower triangulation, though incomplete, placed her phone near Old Cedar Pass at approximately 12:04 p.m. That meant she had driven directly from the church to that road barely 20 minutes away. Whatever had happened almost immediately after she hung up. When investigators replayed the voicemail, several noted the tone of the man's voice. It wasn't angry or rushed. It was calm, controlled, as if he was delivering a message, not a threat. That one detail would haunt everyone involved. The recovered items from the van were cataloged and sealed: the Bible, the phone, a child's stuffed toy, a pair of small sneakers still buckled under a seat. The sheriff ordered the road permanently sealed after the excavation, calling it sacred ground. But even as the official report classified the cause as vehicular descent, undetermined intent, the people who'd worked the case knew there was more to the story. When Melissa's funeral was held that spring, the turnout filled the same church she'd left 15 years earlier. The pastor spoke softly about closure and faith, but there was an unease in the air, the kind that comes when answers don't bring peace, only more questions. In the final row, Henry Dobbins sat alone, the man whose persistence had brought the truth back into the light. Yet as the choir sang and the candles flickered, he couldn't stop thinking about the voicemail. About that voice. The investigation into the call began quietly, without public notice. Phone records from 2009 were subpoenaed again, This time, new technology made it possible to extract data that hadn't been readable before, and within weeks, the search traced the prepaid phone's purchase to a store not far from Pine Hollow, one frequented by someone no one had ever thought to question. Someone who'd been there the day she disappeared. Someone she had trusted. The discovery would unravel everything Pine Hollow thought it knew about faith, guilt, and the secrets people keep buried. When the lab confirmed where the prepaid phone had been purchased, it felt like the final missing piece of a puzzle no one wanted to complete. The receipt, preserved in a digital record from a hardware store 2 towns over, listed only the transaction time and the last 4 digits of a credit card. But when investigators matched those digits to archived financial statements, the name that appeared was one almost everyone in Pine Hollow knew: Grant Miller, the long-serving pastor of St. Andrew's Chapel. It didn't make sense at first. Grant Miller had been one of the first people interviewed when Melissa and her sons went missing. He'd led vigils, spoken at press conferences, prayed with the family. For years, he'd been the comforting face behind the pulpit whenever the town gathered to mourn. He'd retired quietly in 2018, moving south to Alabama with his wife, leaving behind a spotless record and a congregation that still quoted his sermons. The idea that he could be connected to Melissa's disappearance was almost unthinkable. But the data didn't lie. The prepaid phone that had called Melissa outside the church, the one that left her pale and shaken before she drove away, had been purchased by him. Investigators checked again. The timestamp lined up to 2 days before her disappearance. Surveillance footage from the store was long gone, but the payment history sealed it. The number belonged to him. The sheriff's department contacted the Alabama Bureau of Investigation to arrange an interview. By then, Miller was 71, living in a modest house outside Birmingham. When they arrived, he seemed calm, almost relieved to see them. He didn't ask why. They were there. He just nodded, sat down, and told them to close the door. What he confessed to over the next several hours changed everything Pine Hollow believed about that Sunday morning. In 2008, a year before she vanished, Melissa Crane had gone to her pastor for help. She'd been struggling, her marriage had ended, she was raising 2 boys on her own, working long hours at the elementary school cafeteria. She'd been part of St. Andrews since she was a teenager. To her, Miller wasn't just a pastor, he was a mentor, a father figure. But according to his statement, that relationship crossed a line. He described it as a mistake born of weakness. For months, they met in secret, both terrified of what it would mean if anyone found out. Eventually, Melissa ended it. She wanted to rebuild her life, she told him, and she needed to focus on her boys. He claimed he accepted that at first. But then she told a friend in confidence, a friend who also attended the church. Rumors began to swirl, quiet ones, but enough to reach Miller's ears. That was when the fear set in. He told investigators that the prepaid phone was his idea of a private line, a way to speak without suspicion. He bought it under a false name, using it only to contact Melissa after she began ignoring him. The voicemail found on her phone, the one that said, "You can't hide them forever," was his voice. He admitted to it without hesitation, but he insisted he never meant it as a threat. He said he was desperate, angry, trying to stop her from telling anyone. "I thought I was saving my reputation," he told them. "I didn't think she'd run." What investigators pieced together next filled in the blanks that had haunted the case for 15 years. On the morning of March 22, 2009, Miller called Melissa just before the end of the church service. Witnesses had seen her step outside, visibly upset, phone pressed to her ear. According to his confession, he told her he knew she was planning to speak with his wife and that if she did, he'd make sure she lost her job at the school. She hung up without responding. 15 minutes later, she strapped her sons into the van and drove away. Not east toward home, but west toward Old Cedar Pass, the long, winding back road that used to lead out of town. Miller said he waited in his office for hours that afternoon, expecting a call, an apology, some sign she'd calm down. None came. When he heard that Melissa and her boys were missing later that night, he convinced himself it was coincidence. He deleted the call logs, destroyed the prepaid phone, and buried the truth under layers of prayer and guilt. He gave statements to police, offered condolences to her parents, and stood in front of his congregation as the face of comfort, while secretly carrying the knowledge that he had caused the panic that drove her away. As investigators listened, they realized there would be no trial. The statute of limitations for coercion and reckless endangerment had long expired, and Miller's health was failing. Still, his confession gave the family something they'd never had before: a reason. Not justice, not closure, but a reason. When the news broke, Pine Hollow fractured. Some refused to believe it. Others said they'd always suspected something strange about how he handled the case. Parishioners tore down photos of him from the church hallway. A few defended him, saying he was only human, that God forgives even the worst sins. But for Melissa's parents, the revelation reopened every wound. Their daughter hadn't been taken by strangers or swallowed by the woods. She'd been driven to terror by someone she trusted. In the following weeks, reporters revisited the old footage, Miller standing beside Melissa's father at vigils, leading prayers for her return, comforting her children's classmates. It looked different now. Every word of compassion felt hollow. Every sermon about truth and forgiveness felt like a performance. The sheriff released a final statement confirming the findings. Melissa Crane's death, though officially ruled accidental, was now understood to be the direct result of psychological coercion. It wasn't a crime of violence, he said quietly. It was a crime of fear. Forensic psychologists later explained that Melissa's reaction that morning, her sudden flight, her decision to take the back road, fit what they called an acute panic response. Under extreme emotional stress, the brain narrows its focus, making every action feel like escape, even when it leads to danger. For Melissa, the road wasn't just a route, it was a way out. Pastor Miller passed away less than 6 months after his confession. In his final note to investigators, he wrote, "I never meant to hurt her. I only wanted her silence. Now that silence is all I have left." When the news reached Pine Hollow, the town fell quiet again, the way it had in the first days after she disappeared. St. Andrew's Chapel closed for renovations shortly after, though many suspected it was just to give people time to forget. Melissa and her sons were buried together beneath a single headstone in the local cemetery. The inscription read simply, "Together, at last, in peace." Her parents chose not to mention the circumstances. They said their daughter had suffered enough in life. But for many who remembered her, the story never fully settled. Some said Miller's confession didn't explain everything, that there was still something missing between the phone call and the crash. Others just couldn't reconcile the image of the man who baptized their children with the one who destroyed a family. In the end, Pine Hollow carried two versions of the same truth. One where a frightened mother made a fatal mistake, and another where the person meant to guide her pushed her past the edge. And for Henry Dobbins, the retired trooper who'd refused to let the case die, that was the hardest part. He'd spent years chasing ghosts, only to find the answer had been sitting in the front pew the whole time. When asked later why he kept going, he said it wasn't about justice. It was about her boys, he said. They deserved to be found, even if what we found wasn't what we wanted. The mystery that began on a Sunday morning ended 16 years later, in a confession that no one could forgive. The town of Pine Hollow finally got its truth, but the truth, as it turned out, didn't set anyone free. It only reminded them how easily good people can become the reason others vanish.